have to have four independent evolutionary trails to have the flying creatures that exist today. Because there are distinct flying creatures besides the birds, so you have to have an evolutionary path that ends with birds, the flying creatures called birds. But what other types of creatures also fly besides birds? Insects, mammals, okay. Mammals, there's flying mammals, bats representative of them, which are different from birds, so you have to have an evolutionary path that leads or ends in flight within the mammal, what is it, family? I'm not a biologist. The group of mammals. But some of you mentioned insects, but there's another flying creature. Yep, that's it. Pterosaurs or reptiles. So you have to have an evolutionary path for reptiles for evolution to be true. Now, you don't have to have any path, obviously, if you're a creationist. God creates by speaking things into existence. And then you've already mentioned the insects, a wide variety of different flying creatures that are under the category of insects. So you'd have to have a path for them as well. So that contradicts evolutionary thinking as well. And there's just a photo of a bat, a mammal. And we don't have any of these alive, but we have fossil evidence that these creatures lived in the past. And more than likely, they were reptiles, Pterosaurus. So the evolutionary concept of one cell in the ocean is contradicted by Genesis 1. The sequence doesn't fit the evolutionary sequence. You also have to have long processes for evolutionary ideas to work. And what do we have in verse 21? God speaks in verse 20. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." And God immediately created the great sea monsters. Attention is called to that, interestingly. So verse 21, the great sea monsters and every living creatures that moves with which the waters swarmed. That's a reference back to verse 20, same creatures. And it's kind of a summary of the same thing. The emphasis is God created these and it was immediate. And if that's not clear enough, the last part of the verse, after it speaks of the winged creatures, and God saw that it was very good. In other words, it's completed. It's done. It's finished. So that contradicts the long processes. We have the flying creatures. I mentioned the four flying creatures. Then we have the focus on dinosaurs. The Hebrew word here, tanin, that word is used at least in three different ways. In Psalm 74:13, sea monsters is tanin. It also is translated in Isaiah 27:1. But it also refers to the dragon later on. That's interesting because it refers to, the dragon is the way it's translated, but it refers to Leviathan, which is also referred to in other passages. Then we have Exodus 9 through 12. We won't look up that one, but that one refers to the serpents that Moses utilized amongst the Egyptians. There's other words that are used. Behemoth, that's New American Standard Translation, in Job 40. That more than likely is a clear reference to a dinosaur. And then another reference to Leviathan, Job 41. Rahab, Psalm 89:10. This is probably a deliberate attempt by Moses to refute a lot of pagan ideas that existed amongst not only the pagan cultures that the Israelites had contact with, but a lot of traditions and a lot of mythology that had built up over time, even amongst the Israelites, that referred to these large creatures, which are probably references to a memory of dinosaurs that existed before the flood and then existed probably shortly after the flood. And a lot of these traditions, you find them in many cultures. And I think what Moses is doing here is deliberately saying God created these, and when he created them, they were very good. You have the divine evaluation. So what he's saying, if you have fear concerning these creatures, if you believe some of these myths that are distortions of the truth, they all go back to a reality of God creating beings that in fact actually existed in the past. And today we have fossil evidence of some of large creatures that are probably behind the background to a lot of this mythology. Now this is the only specific creature that's mentioned in the creative days. It almost seems that Moses is deliberately calling attention to this particular group of large animals. Does that make sense? So it's a refutation of pagan ideas, pagan mythology, and giving the idea that God ultimately is the creator of anything that exists, including these large animals. Here's the verse here. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. That's the same word, tanin. And that's probably a reference similar to Psalm 89:10. You yourself crushed Rahab. This is one of those traditions. Like one who is slain, you scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. So God is the one. Not only Genesis, but several other passages tell us that God is omnipotent, God is more powerful than all of these creatures. Just a photograph to kind of give you a feel for some of the creatures that we found in fossil form in comparison to man. Give you a scale. So, it doesn't fit the evolutionary scheme. These large creatures, and by the way, evolution has a very hard time explaining any path for these large creatures. There's no evolutionary path. So there's a problem there, even with the creatures themselves. And it says that these creatures were created after their kind. Hebrew word min, we looked at this when we talked about the plants. It speaks of distinctions in the created kinds. There's distinctions that God built into his creation. That refutes evolution itself. In fact, it's a boundary, as I'll mention in a moment. Min occurs 10 times in Genesis 1. So more times there than anywhere else. 33 in all in the Old Testament. And always, in fact, a large number of them also occur in the flood account. God took animals on the ark after their kind. The idea is that there's limitation of variation. There's boundaries. There is variation. We would, as creationists, admit that and allow that. That's not, and I don't like to use the word microevolution, even though that's a word that sometimes is used. The better word is variation. God built into each species all of the genetic information to allow for the variety within the kinds. And what it also specifies is that there's actually built into the creation a permanence, such that creatures can't cross those boundaries. And 1 Corinthians 15 is a biblical statement that tells us that very fact. All flesh is not the same flesh. There is one flesh of men. In other words, there's a distinction between men, and another flesh of beasts, another flesh of birds, and another fish. Here's the category that we have in this passage here: birds and fish. So there's a distinction. So verse 20 is the revelation, followed by God articulating that revelation, speaking into existence these creatures. Verse 21 is a statement of God creating, following through. And then we have the divine assessment. It was very good. So these large creatures were not tainted by sin until after the sin in Genesis chapter 3. Let's spend some time looking at the mechanism, because I think the implication of men also tells us, because it sets these boundaries, that there's going to be a problem in other areas of evolution. Now, what is the mechanism or the main mechanism of evolution, according to the evolutionist? You know it? Mutations. So let's spend a little time looking at mutations. Now, in Darwin's day, there was a great endeavor, and the beginnings of the study, well, probably not the beginnings, but the very early study of this area of mutations, because there was a great motivation in Darwinian thinking to be able to prove that that creatures evolved through the mechanism of evolution. So there was a lot of research being done. And what I'm going to share with you is 150 years of research. And this is the end product of that research, and 150 years of effort primarily amongst evolutionists, and almost exclusively by evolutionists. And they admit, if they're honest, those that are, and many of them are, they admit the conclusions that I'm going to share with you here. And I've got them listed on the back side on the transparency, and I've got kind of blanks on the front side of your outline sheet. But let's take a look at them. Well, first of all, what are they? I think my voice is coming back here. Somebody's praying. Well, mutations are sudden small changes in the DNA code of genes. Now, we know this today. The whole area of genetics is a relatively new science, so now we know a lot about mutations. So it's the sudden small changes in the DNA code of genes which are passed on to an organism's offspring. That would be a good definition of mutations. The importance of them, Ernst Mayr, one of the most famous evolutionists, shows how important they are for evolutionary thinking. He says it must not be forgotten that mutation is the ultimate source of all genetic variation found in natural populations and the only new material available for natural selection to work. In other words, without mutations, what? No evolution.